Good afternoon. My name is Richard Marks, and I'd like to welcome you to a lecture in the Chancellor's Series on Crisis and Change, sponsored by the Associated Student Speakers Program. Today's lecture will be followed by an informal question and answer period panel discussion featuring the Chancellor, today's speaker, Professor Ronald Takaki, and Professor Richard Weiss in the Men's Lounge. We have coffee, and we'd like you all to join us at the conclusion of this lecture. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our distinguished Chancellor, Chancellor Young, to introduce our distinguished guest. Thank you very much.
Sounds as if we have a lot of distinguished people here today. I'm very glad to be able to be with you today to introduce the speaker in this second in a series which has been called Crisis and Change, which is sponsored jointly by the Chancellor's Office and the Associated Student Speakers Program. This series will be continuing throughout the year, and we have a number of speakers who I'm sure you will all be very interested in hearing. We're especially pleased to have with us today a man who is going to be speaking on a topic of great concern to all of us within this general area of crisis and change, and a man whose work, whose writings, whose research, and whose understanding of the situation makes him extremely well qualified to speak on this particular topic. I do not need to spend a great deal of time introducing Professor Hofstadter. You all know his work, I am sure. He is the author of many books that have been very widely acclaimed, including two books, The Age of Reform and Anti-Intellectualism in the United States, both of which won for him Pulitzer Prizes. It is a great pleasure for me to be able to introduce to you, speaking on the question of violence in America, Professor Richard Hofstadter.
Chancellor Young, Mr. Marks, ladies and gentlemen, we are very nervous about ourselves today in America, and no doubt one of the concerns that makes us most nervous is our sense of our own violence. This concern reached a peak in the wake of the assassination of Martin Luther King, the epidemic of more than 100 ghetto riots that followed it, and then only a few weeks later, the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. Everyone asked, what's America coming to? Arthur Schlesinger Jr. remarked last June, at this moment, we are the most frightening people on this planet. People began to ask, after all the pride we had taken in our institutions and our way of life, are we in fact more violent than other people? Have we always been so violent? Are we growing more violent now? If so, how can we stop? What's wrong with us? If this mood of self-re-examination, so noticeable a year ago, is to be something more than a kind of breastbeating that merely discharges a momentary panic and then leaves us free to go on very much as we were before, it must be put to some more constructive purpose and lead to a new phase in self-knowledge. We have to move from the question, what is wrong with us, to the question, what should we do? There is, I believe, not much to be gained by loud protestations of guilt or in a psychological re-examination of ourselves, or certainly not from incantations about law and order, unless these are linked to an effort to re-examine and change our institutions. I would like to discuss the problem of violence in historical perspective, not on the assumption that history is going to give us some magic key that will unlock the subject, but merely for the purpose of reopening the question with our history in mind, whether we have not had a misleadingly smug image of ourselves as a people. There are, of course, at least two ways, not mutually contradictory, in which one could look at the problem. One could compare the United States, present and past, with other countries vis-a-vis this question of violence, something I don't have the data to do, nor, to the best of my knowledge, has it in any serious sense been done. And perhaps if I were to follow this practice, I would end up being a little less harsh with us than I propose to be. The second thing is to compare the United States now with our own past, and even this I can do only in a hasty and rudimentary way today. But I think the perspective that will come from so doing will be of considerable use. Something has to be said at the beginning about the different kinds of events we have in mind when we talk in general terms about violence today. We have in mind, of course, violence directed against persons prominent in our political life, like the two Kennedys, Martin Luther King. We think also of violence directed against persons not prominent in politics, but violence which stems from political motives, such as the killing of the Mississippi Three, of Medgar Evers, of Viola Liuzzo, and many others. Then there is group violence, which confronts us today, particularly in the form of ghetto riots, though other forms of group violence, race riots, which are different from ghetto riots, election riots, vigilante riots, and the like, have long been a part of our story. Finally, there is the general category of crimes of personal violence, quite unrelated to any political or civic goal, and these, next to the war in Vietnam, have probably become the most important, preoccupying single fact in the mind of the American electorate. These types of violence stem from somewhat different sources and have different consequences, and for certain purposes will help to keep them distinct. By now, it will probably surprise no one to hear me say that American history is quite full of violence, though no social historian has ever given us a book on the subject that does justice to its frequency in our past or explains its pattern. Aggression, after all, is a normal fact of human experience in our culture and in other cultures, in private life and civil life. The intensity of aggression naturally varies from time to time, and so long as it remains moderate, it may go no further in politics than extremist ideas or out-of-pattern third parties or whatever. It may show itself in nothing more sinister than heightening political activity, demonstrations, and so on. But after a certain intensity of frustration is passed and certain threshold has gone beyond, aggression turns into turmoil and even to major violence. If we think of aggressive behavior as a normal and recurrent element in human life, we might say that one of the primary goals of a sound political life is to keep the frustrations of various segments of the population at a sufficiently low pitch not to pass this threshold, to permit aggression to expend itself, but to channel it in nonviolent ways. Again, one of the primary problems of law enforcement is to keep retribution and punishment serious enough to be an inhibiting force, but one of the things we are discovering today is that law enforcement, badly executed, brutally executed, can become itself an additional source of public frustration and an additional spurt of violence. What I would like to suggest to you is that what we perceive in the first instance as a rise in violence among the people should be seen as being at bottom a political failure. It will lead us nowhere to inquire endlessly whether we are temperamentally as a people too violent, though this is a perfectly possible proposition to entertain, and just to ask that we repent. It may lead us somewhere to ask what areas of our system of law and government have failed to develop or change with the times to meet changing problems with enough resilience. This doesn't mean that I am asking how the government can be made more effectively repressive. I point in the opposite direction. I think instead we must ask how government, and above all federal government, because I think this is where our basic problems are going to be met and solved, can be made more effective as an agency to bring about a condition of social health that can contain mass frustrations below the point at which they explode in aggressive violence. Let's look at a few categories of violent acts. We can be nothing more than impressionistic in less than an hour. A few categories that have concerned us recently. If we begin by asking whether the United States is, in our time, more violent than other industrialized societies, I think we would have to say that it is. This would still be true even if for the moment we could forget about ghetto riots altogether and look only at other kinds of civic violence. Among the nations of the Western world, for example, we stand high, not only recently, but over some span of time, in assassinations and attempted assassinations. If we begin with Lincoln, 4 of the last 20 presidents of the United States have been killed, and attempts have been made on the lives of 3 others: Franklin Roosevelt just before his inauguration, Harry Truman, and Theodore Roosevelt during his 1912 campaign. If we were to compare ourselves, for example, with Great Britain, which now stands in some respects as a model of nonviolent procedures, no English prime minister has been shot since a lunatic assassinated Spencer Perceval in 1812. Looking at continental Europe, our situation is a bit better because there they had a rash of assassinations of crowned heads of state between 1890 and 1914. But for the period since 1914, we've passed into the lead in this particular form of public violence among the countries of the Atlantic civilization, at least. And we must reckon with the chastening fact that on past form, the probability that a 20th century president will be shot at is alarmingly high. Thus far, 5 out of 10. Turning away from public assassination to violent crimes against private persons, the United States has an unenviable position of leadership here too. If we take private homicide as our index, the United States homicide rate will immediately strike us as rather out of line. I think it not unfair to say that this country is one of the leading producers of homicide among the nations of the world because it is a gun culture, as most of the civilized industrial countries are not. We have an extraordinary murder rate, and a high proportion of all murders are committed with guns. In 1967, there were 7,700 of them, as well as 55,000 aggravated assaults and over 70,000 robberies. We have only rough estimates of the number of usable firearms in the country at large, but they range from a minimum of about 50 to 100 million guns. The point here is that whether or not our people are by disposition or temperament or whatever you want to call it more violent than others, our laws simply do not deprive them of the opportunity to commit violent acts with guns. What is important is not the temper of the people here, but the state of the laws. All this shows up rather clearly in the figures. In the United States, the rate of murders committed with guns per 100,000 population is 2.7. In England and Wales, by comparison, where one has to have a certificate from the local police before a long gun can be bought, the rate is only 0.05, that is to say, less than 1/50th of ours. Japan, which has certainly had its share of militarism and violence in its history, nonetheless prohibits entirely the private ownership of guns, and it somewhat outdoes England by a slender margin. Canada, a country which, like us, has a frontier inheritance, but which, unlike us, requires all handguns to be registered, has a murder rate of about 1/5 of ours. And even within our country, despite the ease with which guns can be carried across state lines, states with weak gun laws have considerably more murders per 100,000 than states with strong ones. For example, the rates in New York, New Jersey, and Rhode Island, 3 states with strong laws, are 4.8, 3.5, and 1.4 respectively. Whereas states with notably weak gun laws, Texas, Mississippi, Louisiana, have between 9 and 10 murders per 100,000, and Nevada tops them all with 10.6. I don't want to turn this lecture on the general theme of violence into a harangue on gun control laws, though I admit that I would if I thought it would do any good. But I'm quite persuaded that the cause of serious gun control in the United States is quite hopeless. A majority of the population, over 60%, has expressed its desire for such laws in the wake of the assassinations and violence we've had, but they are overwhelmed by the powerful lobby of the National Rifle Association and kindred interests, and by the persistent indifference of legislators from rural areas and small towns to the problems of an urban society. I suppose that nothing short of a total prohibition of handguns, except for a few highly controlled exceptions, together with the careful registration of all long guns and all long gun users, would be enough to cut materially the rate of violence in our country. But I suppose that instead we will go on enduring the extraordinary cost in lives of what I think must be seen as fundamentally not a failure of temperament, but a failure of politics. One of the most interesting things about guns, I'm very reluctant to let go of this subject, you'll see, is the number of what might be called friendly murders bears a very high proportion to murders committed in the course of robbery or other crimes. By friendly murders, I mean murders of family, friends, and acquaintances that happen unpremeditatedly and spontaneously in the course of quarrels or in fits of rage or depression. The man you read about in that inevitable newspaper story last week or last month or last year who shot his wife and 3 children and then himself was a man who would surely have told you that that the revolver he kept in his drawer was to protect his family. Let's look then at spontaneous collective violence, mob actions, rioting, which is the most dangerous form of domestic violence. Are we here worse off than we were before? I can only give a partial answer to this question, though I hope it may bring the problem into some focus for you. If we are concerned with the sheer volume of mob violence, it is by no means clear that we have more of it today than we've had at many points in our history. Indeed, there is so much of it in our past that we have no firm basis even for saying that we have become more violent as a people. Indeed, there are whole areas of violence which are still very much in evidence as recently as 30 or 40 years ago, such as violence in labor disputes and in lynching, which have almost entirely disappeared. However, there's another way of looking at this problem, which is not to ask about the volume of violence alone, but about its political role and its political effects. And here, and I'll come to this again at the end, one can't be so confident or so reassuring. If we look at our history with an eye for violence, it's astonishing how much we find, and what an amazing capacity we have as a people for repressing the unhappy memories of our history. This country has a monumental tradition of do-it-yourself violence, to which I must confess that my fellow historians and I have done very little justice. I rarely find myself in much agreement with H. Rap Brown, but I find myself compelled to admit that he had something when he said that violence is as American as cherry pie. I'm not going to say anything today about our wars, the most obvious and important form of violence. I leave them out only because you know about them in a general way, and except for Indian wars, I shall pass them by. Otherwise, one hardly knows where one should begin, with assassinations and attempted assassinations, with political riots, election riots, with farm riots, anti-mortgage riots, with petty rebellions like the Dorr Rebellion of 1842. The category of violence used against and by labor would make a tremendous history. Then there are, of course, anti-immigrant riots, anti-Catholic riots, anti-abolitionist riots, vigilantism on the frontier, systematic outlawry, rustling. There are student riots, there are slave revolts, there is a long and grisly history of lynchings. There are gangster shootouts, draft riots, violence over fugitive slaves, food riots, race riots, by which I mean interracial upheavals, and ghetto riots, by which I mean those organized in our own time mainly for their social protest function. All in all, it is a staggering story, and once we get into the 18th century, though we had some considerable show of mob action once we get into the 19th, though there was a lot before in the 18th, we can hardly get away from recurrent violence on a year-by-year basis. It is true, of course, that if we were going to be comparative, that we have nothing in our history since the Civil War to compare with what has happened in the liquidation of the Jews of Europe by the Nazis, of the kulaks under Stalin, or more recently in Indonesia or Biafra. We have no monopoly on violence by any means. I'm merely trying to suggest that we have a great deal more than we tend to be aware of. And an interesting thing about the pattern of our violence, perhaps you can get some encouragement from this if you like, is the way in which it has somehow been coexisted with a remarkable history, with the great and significant exception of the Civil War, of political stability. Not very long ago, with the needs of this lecture in mind, I asked my research assistant to compile for me, beginning only with the 19th century, what I called a calendar of American violence. He returned several weeks later in a state of despair, with 14 single-spaced, extremely economically condensed tabulation of incidents of violence, enumerating well over 150, which he assured me, on his reckoning, only scratched the surface, and he did not see how he could go on. We estimated together that a full calendar might be 4 or 5 times as long and would be much easier to expand if we had good histories of all our cities. He reminded me that I had instructed him only to record major episodes in which persons were killed or in which there were large numbers injured or extensive property damage. He pointed out to me that once one moved slightly below this rather demanding level that I'd set to a level of lesser violence, but to acts which would be nonetheless highly significant politically because of their threatening significance, the number of possible items would multiply beyond our taking any reckoning of them. We concluded that tabulating an adequate calendar of violence would require a large research staff working over a considerable time. But I can give you only, in our brief time, some glimpses into this abbreviated calendar. If we went back a little less than a century and a half to the 1830s, our calendar would open perhaps in 1831 with the Nat Turner slave insurrection in Virginia, in the course of which 57 persons were killed, and after which 19 blacks were hung illegally. This was followed by a counter-massacre in which over 100 blacks were killed. In 1834, a few years later, spring election riots in New York City. Democrats fight Whigs, numerous wounded. 1834-5, abolition riots in New York City. Fights between blacks and whites over the use of Chatham Street Chapel. Immense mob in 5 Points, that was a tough part of town, burning houses, etc. Later, a nativist riot, at least 1 killed. And so it goes. More riots in Philadelphia, some in other cities. One can count between the 1820s and the 1860s, 8 riots, major riots in New York, 6 in Cincinnati, 4, if I remember correctly, in Philadelphia. And as I say, we need more city histories. If we were to jump down some span of time to the era of exactly 100 years ago, we would, of course, find ourselves smack in the middle of the bitter episode of Reconstruction, and it would not surprise you to hear that my research assistant's annotations here, incomplete though they are too profuse to tackle it all. We would begin, however, I'm sure, in 1865 with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. There are so many items of violence in connection with Reconstruction in Louisiana alone that it is impossible to do more than suggest their frequency and seriousness by saying that during a 10-year period from 1866 to 76, it is estimated that 3,500 people, mostly black, were killed. And of course there is a good deal of other Reconstruction violence and some episodes in northern cities that had nothing to do with Reconstruction directly. By 1877, we have entered a period of great violence arising out of disputes between capital and labor, which I would like to discuss separately but briefly. But then suppose we step down to a period of about 50 years ago. Here we would surely want to start in 1917 with the East St. Louis riots between blacks and whites, in which resentments over black scabs at an aluminum plant were triggered off by false rumors of shootings. Before it was over, 3,000 whites were roaming the streets, firing into homes in the black districts. The blacks shot back and picked off a police car. The next day they were pulled off streetcars, stoned, clubbed, kicked, and shot, and in the end, 48 were killed, hundreds were wounded, 300 buildings were destroyed. The same year was the year of a great race riot in Houston, and in 1919, with the war just over, there were so many episodes that we might well stop with that year, which would include not only a number of full-fledged race riots, including the tremendous Chicago riot of July 1919, but also quite an extensive series of bombings. Well, so much for the calendar. I suppose something ought to be said about Indian wars, though I've left the more formal ones out here. Indian wars fit somewhere in between formal wars and guerrilla border warfare, though most of the serious action here was entrusted to the United States Army. Indeed, the Army's ROTC manual, a military history, says concerning the Indian wars, I quote, "The Indian wars gave the Army a rich tradition and a heritage that was to contribute much to its esprit de corps. They left the Army lean and hard and provided excellent training for the junior officers who were later to lead it in greater battles. Certainly there were enough actions to keep the junior officers busy. Putting aside such episodes of the pre-Civil War period as the Seminole Wars, there were just between 1865 and 1891 13 different campaigns against the Indians and, on the Army's records, 1,067 separate engagements. Perhaps these so-called wars belong in our history of more informal violence, partly because of their special character. Very often they were just massacres and counter-massacres, with the white man, of course, prevailing in the end. A case in point here, which is very familiar to everyone, would be the destruction of Custer's force, of which most Americans have heard. Relatively few, however, know about the so-called Cheyenne massacre of 1864. In the spring and summer of that year, the killing of many Indians resulted in such mutual hostility between whites and Indians in the Colorado region that one colonel, I believe he was a colonel in the militia rather than the regular army, one Colonel J.M. Chivington, a Methodist preacher in civil life, decided to crush the Indians altogether. With some 900 men and several howitzers, this Christian crusader came upon an Indian camp of Cheyennes and Arapahoes containing about 200 warriors and 500 women and children. At sunrise, they struck with their howitzers, rifles, and knives and butchered the Indians without regard to age or sex, scalping them, sometimes mutilating bodies, and leaving few survivors. Chivington and his men were applauded in Denver, but a congressional committee investigated the act and called it, I quote, "a foul and dastardly massacre which would have disgraced the various savages." This act of butchery aroused the Indians to new hostilities against the whites, and they began to burn, plunder, and kill, and in the end, more than 8,000 troops had to be withdrawn from the Civil War to subdue them at great cost. It takes some effort of the historical imagination to try to recreate the atmosphere of murderous hostility and violence created in that region by episodes of this kind. No discussion of our violence would be complete without attention to lynchings, by which I mean public murders in defiance of the law, conceived and carried out by mobs. Figures on lynching are just a little bit uncertain because of some discrepancies about particular incidents, but the variations are slight, and the figures I find show at a minimum between 1882 and 1945 a total of 4,908 lynchings. It is perhaps important to say that these figures include only lynchings successfully carried out, since there were hundreds and hundreds that were prevented. I don't have an adequate racial breakdown for this entire period, but for the years 1889 to 1932, there were 2,900 Negroes and 791 whites lynched, nor were the victims always men. There are records of the lynchings of at least 92 women. The leading states in proportion of lynchings to population, of course, have been the states of the Old South, the Border South, and Southwest. But don't imagine that lynching has been confined to these regions. There are only 4 states of the Union in which there is no record of lynching: Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Vermont. To the best of my knowledge, lynching is a criminal practice that hardly exists outside the United States, though one might argue for some exceptions. The summary judgments executed sometimes by Russian peasants against horse thieves partake of this character, and in the anti-Semitic pogroms of Eastern Europe, one may find parallels. Another area which deserves examination, about which I can be no more than superficial, is the history of the National Guard. In 1892, a committee of the House of Representatives prepared a report on the efficiency of the militia, in which the events of the previous 25 years were summarized. Between 1867 and 1892, and incomplete listings of the callings out of the National Guard show a grand total of 176 actions, usually to suppress riots, sometimes in labor disputes, very often to protect jails and their occupants against potential lynchers. But if we had full figures from those states which responded that the militia was called out many times, but they have no exact record, the figure would swell to well over 200 actions in this 25-year span of time. Again, labor disputes. Hardly possible here to do more than touch on the surface of the long story of violence in this area. Philip Taft, one of the outstanding authorities on international labor movement, has remarked, "Violence in labor disputes is more common in the United States than in any other industrial nation." But what is most remarkable about our having the leadership in this field is that this country has not had a particularly large part of its labor force organized, most of its history in unions, nor has it had a labor movement in which workers have been attracted to extremist doctrines in large numbers, to anarchism, communism, socialism, or syndicalism. Many of our labor incidents have taken place in isolated areas, like frontier mines, others in great industrial centers. Most students who have casually looked at American history know a little bit, for example, about the great violent railroad strikes of 1877, about the loss of lives in the strikes against the Missouri Pacific Railroad in 1886, the bitter Pullman strike of 1894, in which soldiers had to be brought out to restore order and more than a score of people were killed, and the terribly violent incidents in the history of the labor movement in more recent times, particularly the strike of the metal miners in the Coeur d'Alene of Idaho in 1892 and the terrible Cripple Creek strike of 1903. The last major episode in labor violence took place in 1937, the Little Seal strike, during which parading strikers were charged and attacked by the police, and 10 men were killed, many others injured. Now, most exacerbated violence in the history of labor disputes has risen out of a period in which the legitimacy of labor unions was not accepted by employers and often by the public, and it's associated with attempts to organize new industries. Once an industry is organized, a stable pattern of labor relations takes over, violence tends to diminish, and has, of course, in our time. Even though it is not a very important part of the whole story of American violence, I cannot help, coming from Columbia, for the sake of the historical comparison, saying a word about student riots. The old-time college in America, particularly before the Civil War, but up to about the 1880s or 90s, was often a very tumultuous place. There couldn't, of course, be anything like the mass actions of recent years because the colleges were so small. But students were far more restive then than now, and a lot of their action went well beyond mere prankishness. I have very little hesitation in offering you my guess that the proportion of students involved in campus disorders in 1850, say, or 1870 was higher than it is today. The main difference is that those were apolitical. They had very little having to do with matters outside the campus and were precipitated to an extraordinary degree by the tight discipline that students were under and by the sheer boredom of those excruciating classes. It is an extreme case, and I must emphasize this, but I can't help referring to the situation at the University of Virginia in the 1830s. There, in 1838, one professor was beaten up in his lecture room by a student whom he had ordered to leave the class. The following year, another professor was struck in the course of delivering a mild rebuke to students for offensive language, and then, upon leaving his lecture room, was seized by two students, one recently suspended, the other expelled, and vigorously horsewhipped. Over 100 students watched the event, but only a few made half-hearted efforts to intervene. During this period, the professors began to arm themselves and feared, in fact, that there might be attacks with the intent to kill. This conclusion was precipitated by a night in November 1840 of what the historian of the university describes as ungovernable disorder, during which the students fired fusillades of musketry. Finally, indeed, a Professor Davis, who tried to pull a mask off the face of one of the rioters during a nighttime debauch, was shot by the rioter in question and died a few days later. This was at the university that Thomas Jefferson had so hopefully founded. Now, to attempt to offer an adequate explanation of the particular sources of American violence would require an elaborate comparative study, the kind that I have not tried, but let me offer a few suggestions worth investigation, starting with the least important first and ascending in order of importance. The first is America's frontier heritage. There's no doubt, it seems to me, that frontier development encouraged wild ways, put a premium on physical hardihood, self-assertion. And one can also see in early stages of frontier development that problems of crime and law enforcement arose often before adequate police facilities and courts were available and created a disposition among the citizens to take matters into their own hands. This does go far to explain the sources of American vigilantism, but not, of course, its persistence long beyond the frontier period. A second factor is the American attitude toward authority in government, which is quite distinctive. Wherever it comes from, and I won't try to say here, there's an observable, persistent American hostility toward organized authority, a streak of anarchy which dates from the very early days of our national existence. It may derive from the fact that so many Americans were recruited from populations that were particularly spunky about fleeing from authority elsewhere. But whatever the explanation, the fact seems clear, and it has curious consequences. For example, Americans have always been very anti-militaristic without being either anti-war or anti-violent. That is to say, they have been against standing armies and against organized military establishments, but by no means against do-it-yourself violence. They preferred state militia, inefficient and disorderly though militia proved to be, to a substantial federal army. They preferred vigilantism to the organized processes of policing. And there has always been in our history a strong current of hostility to centralized authority, preference for local authority, and local authority is often incompetent to prevent outbreaks of violence without centralized help. Indeed, those areas where we once had a lot of violence and where violence has been diminished or minimized, such as in labor disputes or in lynching, are very often areas in which federal focus has been brought to bear. A third factor in American violence has been the ethnic heterogeneity of our population, which together with employer absenteeism seems to me to go far to account for the militant atmosphere surrounding the attitude of employers toward the labor movement, the feeling that the working class people were not a part of their own. The attitude of employers very much enhanced by the fact that in the past, and to some degree still, our employing class was overwhelmingly white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, and the employees were, quote, foreigners from all parts of the earth, with whom somehow the employers did not feel much common bond and whose humanity they did not fully accept. The fourth factor, but certainly the most important, is the factor of race, which still torments us today. A great deal of our temperament here was forged by an unremitting conflict with the Indians, but still more important for the sustaining problems of our social and political life have been relations between black and white. This nation began its life with a very articulate commitment to the freedom and equality of man, and yet it was a slaveholding nation which even after the end of slavery withheld and still withholds a place in the equal community on a color bar basis. For a long time, the black man was only intermittently in an open war against the constraints of a society that did not admit him to the full fellowship of equality, but I think that day is over. He hasn't himself quite made up his mind whether or to what degree he wants to be in that society, to what degree he wants to follow some kind of a separatist path, but in either case, the relation of the races is likely to continue to be the signal source of mass violence for some time to come. If one looks over the long span of American history, I don't suppose one finds very much substantiation for the idea that we have become increasingly violent or increasingly criminal either in our time. What I think is closest to the truth is that we have had this history of extraordinary violence in our past, which has been for the 30 years or so before 1964 had become relatively quiet, and so we'd allowed ourselves to forget about it. And now in the 1960s, under the stress primarily of race relations, but also under the exacerbation of the war in Vietnam, we have returned to our usual, I would hate to say normal, pattern of violence. In some areas of our life, you can see progress. The rights of dissenters, however imperfectly, are better observed in the United States today than they were 50 or 100 years ago. Election violence has all but vanished. Violence in labor disputes appears to be a thing of the past. Lynchings, once so frequent and incredibly brutal, are also a thing in the past, though I don't want to ignore or minimize the fact that they have been partially replaced in the Deep South by a pattern of occasional political assassination and terror, which I certainly don't want to minimize. Despite these evidences of our slow progress, we have no reason to be complacent. It might be reassuring to say that if we always managed in the past to endure so much chronic violence without going under as a political system, we ought to be capable of doing so in the future, and this may indeed prove to be true. But there are some circumstances that suggest that the trick may be more difficult to turn in the future than it has been in the past, that our situation now is different, and I would like to end by suggesting to you the ways in which I think of it as being different. The first is we've developed a new urbanized politics with many new urgent problems to be solved in an urgent context, and we are still to an extraordinary degree governed by men, particularly in Congress, whose way of thinking is still basically that of rural and small-town America. Secondly, there is the revolution of rising expectations. The black masses no longer accept their being shut out from the American way of life, and though they have made some significant gains, they haven't been nearly enough to keep up with the extraordinary subjective revolution in their expectations. They are driven to a mood of desperation. They feel that they have not been making their way into the body politics in the same way that other ethnic minority groups have done before them, and they have begun to despair of the peaceful and gradualist techniques that our society supposedly holds forth. Third, our foreign policy commitments and failures exacerbate the situation in two ways. First, they deprive us, witness the war in Vietnam, of the massive resources from our economic surplus that could be deployed to meet some of these social problems with some success. Second, they introduce a whole separate set of frustrations and animosities that have been dividing the body politic. Fourth, we've seen the development in our time of a new kind of politics, particularly on the left, a politics of confrontationism. It might be called style politics, or the politics of self-expression. It differs from traditional political methods, not only of center groups, but even of the left in the past, to the extent that its aim seems to be not at all to persuade others, but just simply to express one's sense of outrage against the system or the establishment or whatever it's called. And since much of it hopes to shock, it turns out to be far from persuasive and seems to me to tend to have a polarizing effect on the body politic, though this anxiety is somewhat disconfirmed by, in my mind, by the results of the election. I would be a bit afraid if the confrontationist tactics that have emerged in recent years should prove to be dominant over a long period of time. Fifth, the mass media unintentionally exacerbate the situation simply by being there. There is nothing more vivid than TV reporting of wars, riots, confrontations, incidents, brutalities, and so forth. Today, people feel more excited by controversies, more involved in them. Formerly, in the early 19th century, say, American violence was in most cases local and non-contagious. Now, an exacerbated situation in one part of the country can quickly trigger imitation, set off similar social conflicts in others. Any new technique for agitation, a new device, a new excitement can spread with rapidity throughout the entire nation. I don't want to suggest that mass media reporting is entirely bad. In fact, it has done brilliantly in some cases in focusing our attention on particular brutalities. Nonetheless, in a period of grave excitement like the present, there seems to be no question that skillful minorities are capable of using it as a fulcrum with possible dangerous effects. In summation, then, let me say simply that violence of various kinds is something of which we've had so much in our past, so much more than we usually realize, and so much that it's hard to say that we've been notably more violent on the average over the past generation in our domestic affairs than we were in many earlier periods. However, it does seem clear that the past 5 years have marked one of our momentary, one would say in hope momentary, peaks of violent behavior, but that if we continue at the pace set in these years, the violence of our time may well go down in history as an overall American peak. Moreover, violence takes place in this new setting I've described of racial intransigence, polarization between right and left, confrontationist politics, and mass publicity. So that our own era seems to me to provide new dangers for a contagion of violence that could lead to a major political disaster. I don't predict one, I simply assert it as a possibility. On past form, here again one no doubt would have to expect that the United States, if it shows a reasonable measure of political flexibility and ingenuity, will survive its current tendencies toward violence as it has survived its violence in the past. On the other hand, candor and realism compel me to confess the fears that lurk in the margins of my mind, and to say that now, for the first time in my lifetime, I can imagine more than dimly the outlines of a possible series of historical changes that would bring an end to American liberal democracy. Preventing this may be the major business of our generation.
Over to our Chancellor Young. We'll introduce the panel. We'll start off with a few statements, and then we'll be answering questions from the audience.
Well, I'd like to introduce the others here. You've all been introduced to Professor Hofstadter before. The other two members of the panel here are Professor Ronald Takaki on my far right and Professor Richard Weiss next to him. Do either of you have anything to say to start this off?
Well, nothing very much, except that I would like to say that I think it important in talking about violence in America, perhaps it's best not to discuss it so generically, and that it is terribly important to keep in mind distinctions between types of violence. The kind of violence, say, which is essentially anarchic, which is essentially purposeless and hence merely destructive, and the kind of violence which can be described anyway as socially purposive, as violence, if you will, with a point. I think there is a certain tendency, perhaps, that the feelings of general revulsion, perhaps, that are elicited by acts of anarchic violence, if you will, or pointless violence, to kind of dismiss violence generically, and we may wish that we could dismiss it, but I think it is important to realize that in America, just as much bad has come from violence, so much good has come from it too. And it would be difficult, I think, to explain certain progress in the United States without reference to this. I will simply.
Should I respond to this?
Well,
or
if
does
you,
someone
I
else
think
want
you
to?
can, we can move along completely flexibly. If you have some response you'd like to make, go ahead.
Well, I think that Professor Weiss's distinction between purposeful and pointless, random, totally unfunctional violence is quite a valid one. And while I didn't phrase it in that way, it really, in effect, coincides with the distinction that I did make in my lecture a couple of times between the old-fashioned race riots and the contemporary ghetto riots. The race riots were random. They were not involved either as an instrument of or in response to any significant social movement or social advance. So they were a response to social change, to mass migrations, among other things. Whereas the modern ghetto riot is, unlike the race riot, whether an effective or ineffective instrument of change, one can argue, but it certainly has a function of social protest, seems to me, beyond doubt, and in that sense communicates something and exists within the framework of a movement that and a social change that has some meaning.
Yes. Yeah. Professor Hofstadter's lecture involved, I thought, two parts. First, a description of the forms and the extent of violence in America, as well as violence in Europe. And second, an attempt to analyze the question, why violence in America? What I would like to do at this time is to try to probe the second question, why violence in America? And I hope you will join me in this discussion. Within the context of the question, why violence in America, I would like to look briefly at the question, well, what functions does violence have in America? And here I would like to talk about four functions of violence. And first you have what might be called the function related to the question of deviance and violence. Notice that to a large extent the violence that does take place in America is violence against deviants, or persons who are defined as deviants in our society. And so this raises the question then, well, how is violence related to this, and what is the function of violence then against deviation? And what is very suggestive here then is this book by Kai Erikson on the Wayward Puritans, where the Puritans attempted to define deviance and unleashed violence against deviants, such as the promiscuous Indians or the anarchistic Quakers, And by doing so, they were setting up norms for their society. In other words, violence is a healthy part of the functioning of a society because it helps a society then maintain its identity. We know that promiscuity, for example, is undesirable, hence we unleash violence against those individuals who are promiscuous. And then there's the second function of violence, which is related to what might be called violence and self-hatred. Here we have the idea of the Fanon thesis, where the non-white people are colonized by whites, and this brings on a condition of self-hatred. Now, the function of violence here then takes on this attempt to liberate oneself from one's self-hatred, hence the destruction of the white oppressor. And perhaps to an extent, the violence that is taking place in the ghettos today is an expression of this kind of effort to liberate oneself from self-hatred. And then there's what might be called violence and ambivalence, moral ambivalence. As psychiatrists have shown, whenever an individual is confronted with the anxiety based upon ambivalence, especially moral ambivalence, there is this turning towards violence. Take the case of, say, the Southern fire eaters in the 1850s. If you study very carefully the mind of the Southern pro-slavery radical, he had a great deal of ambivalence over the question of the rightness of slavery. And notice at this time you have increasing violence against black slaves, and especially increasing violence against the abolitionists. So violence in this case, you see, was an attempt to overcome one's anxiety based upon moral ambivalence. Then you have the question of violence and individualism, which Hofstadter has already talked about, this idea that, well, if you can't, in a democratic society, especially in a society that does not have any loyalty towards institutions, a frontier society, of course, you do have private violence. If you take, for example, lynchings, which Hofstadter has talked about, the lynchings that have taken place in the South, to a large extent, took place in rural areas where you do not find the visibility of institutions. And hence you have private violence because there are no mechanisms, you see, to bring about what whites would call justice. And hence you have the justice of the lynching tree. And so you have violence, but the question still is, well, what function does violence play for those who perpetrate violence and for those who receive violence then?
Do you care to comment on that, Professor Hofstadter?
I think Professor Takaki's remarks are quite pertinent. There's only one point at which something he said made me a little uneasy, and it may be because I misinterpreted him. You said that you suggested that the Puritan way of dealing with deviance was by mobilizing violence against them was healthy in the sense that it was functional to the establishment of society and its norms. And I wonder if you really want to convey to anyone the impression that you think that the use of violence against deviance is in very general terms healthy.
Thank you for pointing that out. When I use the term healthy, I meant it from the sociological point of view. Of course, what is healthy might be very immoral, you see. They get
I have one question I would like to ask, and perhaps others of you have some. You mentioned in the concluding section of your remarks, when you were talking about some of the factors that give you concern about the future, the fact that American society or the American governmental structure is by and large ruled by men who come from the rural areas and do not understand the problems of the urban areas of society today. This is certainly true. We have seen nothing to indicate that there is any major change in that direction. But it seems to me that there is an even greater need. It seems to me that we as a society are largely ruled individually in our attitudes by by an ethic which is largely rural. And there has been no displacement of that ethic, which was perhaps appropriate in a period in time when we were dealing with a rural society, by one which is much more appropriate in the kind of urban society in which we live. And so that it is not merely the men who are ruling the structure, but to a considerable extent our whole attitude about the good things of life and what we are all trying to get. And even when we start talking about programs to improve conditions in the urban area and in the ghetto, what we are really begin talking about are programs to give these kind of people a life like what people have who live in the rural society rather than an urban. And would you care to expand on that or comment?
Well,
on that?
I think we have made some progress, and I agree that this is another dimension of the problem. Well, we've made some progress in thinking in terms of the requirements and values of an urban society, and that we're partly suspended between this and beliefs stemming from rural society. Perfect case in point here might be the history of attitudes towards Social Security, where 30 years ago and more, it had obviously become a necessity for this society, and the resistance to it was mounted largely in terms of conceptions of sets of individual virtues and individual situations, which were fairly prevalent in a very simple rural and small town society and don't exist under the modern industrialized urban situation. And of course, in that transition we've made on that particular subject, most of us take Social Security for granted nowadays, and very few of us imagine that our moral fiber is totally undermined by living in a society which has it. It's hard for me to say to what extent our cultural lag about rural values is more important than the continuing presence in Congress of a rural overrepresentation. Of course, they're part of the same thing. I was staggered not long ago to see figures of the number of our congressmen who come from towns smaller than 50,000, which is awfully small in this country as it is now constituted. And in the light of this, a decision that was made a couple of years ago, if my memory is correct, I haven't had occasion to check it, an act in Congress becomes much more understandable in the light of this kind of background. It was about 2 years ago, or a little less, that Congress, if I remember correctly, rejected a bill to appropriate $40 million for rat control in the slums. An absolutely staggering act, in my opinion, in this society, almost beyond belief, at a time when we spend $26 billion a year on the war in Vietnam, and when $40 million would be good even as an investment in goodwill, even if it didn't succeed in killing any rats. So people who know something about it tell me it would go a long way. Well, I can only understand an action like this at a time like this in our history, partly in terms of the fact that this is a problem which a great many congressmen simply do not accept as a part of their business. And it must surely be the luxury of people who don't live in large cities and think in terms of large city problems and think in terms of the problems of people who are deprived.
Are there any questions or comments from the audience? Yes.
Well, some people have said a great deal about the supposedly formative effect of violence in entertainment on the mass media and so forth. I have to defer to those who've done studies of this in personal development as the authorities, but my own disposition is to be skeptical about the importance, if not the validity, of this kind of interpretation of the sources of our violence. It seems to me much more important that people see real violence on television, which they know is legitimated by a great many of the people they live among. This is far more significant than the fact that they see the bang-bang things on television with regularity. I think that children, as they grow up, have remarkable protective mechanisms, otherwise we'd all be maniacs, to protect themselves against failing to understand the difference between violence as a part of the theme of art and literature of a very high, very low level. Makes no difference. Nobody ever wrote a great opera about a happy marriage, for example. I mean, pathology is a part of the whole business of conflict that drama and melodrama thrive on. I think that kids protect themselves against this fairly well. I'd like to raise the question how they protect themselves against scenes of real violence, which they know is not actors and ketchup, but real cops, real heads, real napalm, really burnt people, soldiers who are actually dying, which you can see on television with some regularity. Even this may not, if we're lucky, be profoundly destructive, informative, I don't know. But in the light of this, I would not myself expend very much energy worrying about the imaginary violence that is pervaded. Some of it's extreme, some of it's sadistic and could be cut down on, but I do not think it's a central problem. Yes.
In all this discussion that we've had and the last lecture, the last hour, we've been primarily focusing on violence. And if you pick up a newspaper, you'll find that most of the headlines and most of the things that are in the front are about violence. And yet we really don't pay much attention to nonviolence. How many labor transactions get on the front page if they're peacefully considered? How many things happen? How many times is it noticed when something good has come from peaceful action? Every day you gave some great statistics on the violence. 10, one of the biggest one was 10 per 100,000. It's only 100 of the people. What about the people who are not violent? What about all the non-violent things that are going on? How many people go to case meetings? How many people do positive things? We're concentrating on the negative. Negative or violence has a premium. You figure, well, if nothing else works, we can always riot. Everybody's rioting. Yet, in students, how many universities? The University of California is supposed to be a violent university. Yet, how many students are really, burning and bombing and all that? Out of all the campuses of the University of California, you take all the students and all the professors, how many people are actually burning? How many people are actually protesting? Not very many, but you ask anybody in the United States, don't go to Berkeley, that's, it's nothing. How many universities are there in the United States? Yet every university is, racked by violence, and by student protests, and by this and by that. And we always focus on the negative part. Who gets killed? Who gets shot? But what about the peaceful things?
I'm not sure what the question is, but I think there is an answer anyway. I think in social life, just as in the drama, perhaps for different reasons, the mind focuses on what one sees as a problem, as having an element of possible pathology in it. That's all. Surely, if you have a history of the labor movement, 50 years of labor peace can be condensed into a relatively short period of time because it's uneventful. Whereas a few big strikes will take a lot of pages because there is a narrative of events to unfold. And one could, if one read it all this way, become extraordinarily hyperconscious of the elements of pathology. It's the pathology that makes the news, and it's the pathology that we worry about, and not the successes. This, of course, does not mean that the successes don't take place. This is probably the great limit of analyzing any kind of problem like this in terms of what might be called the case method, and that in a way is the method of my lecture, to talk about a lot of different kinds of cases and their frequency in our history. Everyone knows that a lot of people have lived out their lives peacefully from beginning to end in this country. The problem is whether one defines a certain level or a certain type of violence as unacceptable, and then how one tries to explain it, attack it, tell its history, do something about it. That's why we talk about these things.
Yes.
I have a question too.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, Professor Hofstadter, do you think it's very possible that this concern we have for violence in the newspapers is not so much a concern for pathology, but is in itself an expression of pathology? I.e., is it possible that American society needs violence? Not so much internal violence, but take, for example, external violence, so violence in Vietnam. You know, what function does violence in Vietnam play for the American psyche?
I don't know what function of violence in Vietnam plays for the American psyche. I can't answer that question, though. I think that's only the rhetorical tail end of your very legitimate question. Well, one could say, make some very critical comments on our perception of violence, and say that one of the reasons why, as I complained in my lecture, we haven't perceived violence as being as much of a problem as we now perceive it, is that most of the violence in the past was the violence of people who were established or in the mainstream against victims who did not have their spokesman. And today we've reached a moment where a lot of the violence is from the deprived, and is at least threatening to, even if it isn't waged directly against the comfortable. And so we perceive it with much greater clarity than we did previous types of violence. But I don't, while I admit that some measure of violence is inevitable, which was the point of my talking about the nature of human aggression, I am skeptical about being very easygoing about defining the level at which it is functional. This all depends on whether a given act of violence is indeed functional to a purpose. Some small acts of violence to achieve great ends might easily receive their moral endorsement, and we might even pull them out of the realm of pathology and class them somewhere else, class them among the functional. I have serious doubts as to whether most of the violence we see and experience is in fact functional. I remain afraid of it.
The gentleman in the third row here.
May I make a comment on that question?
Yes, go ahead.
I just wanted, in terms of the question that was initially posed, that somehow by studying violence we distort, I think that it's important to understand that in studying society, just as in studying individuals, the examination of aberrations are very instructive as to norms. Since, of course, Freud teaches us that about men. I mean, by studying disturbed individuals, we learn a great deal about normal ones. I think by studying the aberrations of social action, if you will, we also learn a great deal about the norms of the society in which we live. Now, Professor Hofstadter mentioned this with regard to the heightened awareness which violence has brought to America. That is, if 30 years ago you had discussed the racist nature of American society, there probably would have been a good deal more objection to the generalization than there is today. Simply because perhaps we were not so aware of what was an endemic quality of our society, because it was quiet, if you will. It's through the aberration, if you will, it's through the eruption, it's through the abnormality that we perceive the norm much more clearly.
And now to the gentleman in the third row.
When you were discussing I think that's extremely important. And two of the instances you brought up, for instance, gun control law. If in fact violence is both encouraged and perpetrated by the institutions of this country and by an economic system, i.e. capitalism, then if you want to impose gun control law, all you do is you immediately stop one means by which violence will find expression, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you won't find more. In other words, you could have gun control laws in this country and then get involved in more Vietnam. So that in terms of the remedies, we didn't discuss at all what the social implications were and the social causation. The same thing when you very casually said that, for instance, if we could divert, it was either stated or implied that divert the money from Vietnam, and then you can start working on some of the sources in this country. It's very possible that diverting the money from Vietnam wouldn't help at all, because, in other words, it's no accident that we're in Vietnam and not throwing money into the ghetto. That it could be a manifestation of a system. And in terms of not talking about what the implications were for the American government, for an American social and economic system, I wonder if you haven't really left a very acute analysis by just very weakly drawing some sort of remedies.
My lecture wasn't about remedies, and I think that is a separate lecture. The question you raised is perfectly real, but I'm not going to try to tackle it now because that's something like coming into you with a program, and I don't think one could talk about this instructively within the limits of a 3 or 4 minute answer to your question. I could enumerate things, but I really do honestly take my plea. I agree that I left things out. I left them out quite intentionally because my lecture was not about remedies. And yet I couldn't avoid mentioning the possibility of remedies at some point and in some way. But I'm not going to sit here and improvise a social program, nor can I argue out with you at the moment, though it again would be the subject of a very interesting lecture, whether there is any margin for maneuver in this social system or not. I happen to think there is, and it's your privilege to differ with me.
Yes.
I think there are two major categories in which domestic violence can be broken down, and I think you discussed one of the major categories quite well today. This is the category where you can find concrete victims and concrete persons victimizing them, like a rioter burning down a store, and a man in a lynch mob lynching a victim. But there's another category where, though the victims may be precisely defined, you cannot define precisely a person who is victimizing them. And this would be in things like a high rate of infant mortality in the United States compared to Sweden. And I was wondering if you had any comparative statistics relative to how many people die on the one type of violence which was discussed today, as compared to how many people die as a result of the difference in birth rates, infant mortality rates.
No, I think that the category you're introducing is not the category of violence. It may be a more important category, but which is, I think, what you're trying to suggest by your reference to figures, calling for statistics. But it's quite a different thing from violence. That's all.
I think that many people do see it as the violence of a specific system against certain sectors.
Well, I think that's a very poor use of language. I think that's typical of the verbal overkill of our age. I mean, I think one ought to be able and willing to distinguish between things that are other kinds of social pathology and things that might be labeled force but which are not violent, and violence. My subject was violence. I'm quite ready to accept the possibility that other categories of deprivation are more fundamental. As a matter of fact, if one wants to put it that way, to put your challenge in that way, I would accept it as being true without argument. But that just did not happen to be the subject of my lecture.
I had brought it up because you yourself mentioned something like the rat control, which I think can be seen under that category.
That's right.
Yes, the lady.
Well, of course, the whole process of reapportionment corrects it to some degree. There's no doubt about it. But for whatever reason, we still find maybe it's a time lag as well as an apportionment inequity still functioning. The fact remains, and I'm sorry I don't have the figures on this. I have them somewhere, but not here, and not in my head, certainly. The proportion of congressmen coming from communities under 50,000 in this enormous metropolitan age is still really quite staggering. It would surprise you if I could only remember what it was.
Yes.
Professor Hofstadter, I was concerned with your remarks about the politics of confrontation and the role of violence in politics of confrontation. Now, what do you recommend to a group of students, say, like in Berkeley, who are faced with a situation where an institution says, hey, look, here are these rules, follow these rules, and you get what you want. And then when you follow the rules, you go through the procedures, you don't get what you want. So, here we are with a situation in which we go by this few rules, and there was no other means left to us but the politics of confrontation, and which incidentally will only get headlines unless violence in some way, occurs. Now, it seems to me it was obvious in your lecture that you pointed out there are dangers in this, especially with the, growing conservatism of the American electorate. What is the role then? What should our role be if we can't, take this role that has brought us to a point where some changes come about? What role do you suggest for students?
I think that students have not only the right but the duty to agitate for those social changes, whether on or off campus, that seem to them to be just and necessary. And so far as tactics are concerned, confrontationist or otherwise, the only thing I would suggest to them as being desirable that is sometimes, not always, sometimes lost sight of today is that they be calculating about the effect of tactics in terms of their persuasiveness, or if you'll forgive the coinage, dispersuasiveness. It does not, it seems to me, necessarily mark any big net gain if one stages an action through tactics which are widely regarded as questionable and which cause you to persuade a half dozen people who were disposed to agree with you in the first place, and which alienate hundreds outside the sphere of your immediate perspective. I only don't ask that even the confrontation cease, but merely that tactics be conceived in terms of the overall social problem of persuasion, and not in terms of those aspects of persuasion which you can just sensuously perceive because you know that X has suddenly joined you. This is merely an appeal to be politic, if you will, not an appeal to stop carrying on activity in behalf of sound causes. And please don't construe me as maintaining that all student political activity has been of this, to my mind, miscalculated nature. I think a great deal of student political activity has been not only for goals that I happen to think were right, but has been conducted in perfectly sound and rational ways. Some has not. My plea is to be calculating about this and not to make politics an instrumentality of self-expression. The purpose of politics is not to express one's sense of outrage. In my opinion, it is to get certain results.
Yes, in the very back.
I was wondering, it seems in lieu of all the violence that we've had, between the assassinations, between the Democratic Convention in Chicago, that the American people seem determined to maintain the status quo. This election has proved anything. It's proved that they do not want to change. I don't mean to be simplistic about this, but can this merely be explained as popular apathy? Or is there something deeper in the American system?
I'd hardly like to try that, just sitting here as a spontaneous thing. I do think it has a lot to do with the present affluence of the country. I mean, most of the people, as Richard Scammon said the other day in an analysis of the electorate, are not young, not black, and not poor. And it's that large mass of people who are perhaps susceptible of being moved by certain types of appeals to their idealism and even their discretion, but who are basically somewhat satisfied. It's that mass of people that's a substantial problem in this situation.
We're going to have to call this part of the program to close at the present time. I want to thank all of you for coming, and again, thank Professor Hofstadter for his participation with us in this program today.